Hey there, welcome back to the DFSR NFL Bootcamp. My name is James Davis, and today I'm excited to talk to you about using without overusing information from Las Vegas. A lot of times when you're doing any sort of DFS related thing, you can't help but hear what Vegas thinks of any given instance. So first of all, let's actually define what that means. Vegas is obviously just one town in the United States that has a bunch of casinos in it. And so how could Vegas think anything? Well, what we're talking about here are what the sports books and I think even when people use the term Vegas now, they're actually talking a lot about online sports books that are based outside of the United States. So the term may be something of an anachronism, but it still gives us this general concept of what really smart gambling people think is going to happen in any given game. So naturally, this is information we don't want to ignore. While Las Vegas definitely has some different goals, or casinos and sportsbooks have different goals in terms of setting their lines than we do, which is just to predict player performance. There's still a good place to turn for additional information, especially if there might be like insider information surrounding a given event in a given week. So how can we use them without overusing them? Let's get to our 5 key ideas. So the first way, you can actually create a crude model on your own, doing just using Vegas exclusively, which is to say you can create a given team, or you can look at a given team. You can say, on average, the quarterback is responsible for a certain percentage of the scoring on his team. A running back is responsible for another percentage. The wide receivers and tight ends kind of spread out the production among themselves in this other way. And then you can say, Vegas thinks this team's going to score 28 points, so I'll give 40% to the quarterback and I'll give 21% to the running back, and so on. That's actually a crude way that many people create models that are not terrible, in all honesty. You're basically saying, here's where the scoring will likely come from. This is how much comes to the kicker or whatever. And then you're kind of starting from there. And then from there, you really only need to figure out how many yards people are going to come up with. And, if you look at historical averages or something, you can get pretty close. I want to caution you and say that this is absolutely not perfect for a number of reasons. The first is that Vegas, when they're putting out a line, yes, they want to become as accurate as possible, but you also have to remember that the main motivation for sports books oftentimes is to get an even amount of money on both sides. And so they're creating lines that, for instance, take into account public perception, which is not something that we want to account for at all. So while you can kind of loosely assign production to players by using Vegas, you won't get destroyed doing this. It's not something I recommend in terms of doing like a whole stock model, doing those things. Because it also ignores a number of factors, like, Vegas might think that the Pats are going to score 28 points in a given game, but even though Edelman usually accounts for 21%, this game it might be 13% based on the opposing cornerback matchup, or it might be 31%, So you can't only use Vegas and historical data, but again, it will get you fairly far along. One way I think you can come pretty close to just using Vegas is when trying to figure out which defenses and kickers to play. I think particularly when it comes to kickers, you're basically just looking at how many points a team is going to score, how many points typically come from their kicker position, and I think you can sort of take an average. It's pretty tough to forecast, the distance of the field goals. I'm sure it's doable on some level, but if you're kind of hacking together a model at home, just starting with relatively cheaply priced kickers in games with reasonable weather and high totals is going to get you most of the way there. Likewise, for defenses, you at least want to do this as a double check, because again, things like fantasy points per game, terrible indicator of how a defense is going to perform going forward in the season. This can be overweighted by one particularly good matchup, or the one game where they happen to run 2 fumble recoveries back for a touchdown. Especially early in the season, you want to completely ignore fantasy points per game. Much more accurate is going to be what Vegas projects a defense to allow in a given game. And then you can make some modifications based on how likely a team is to get turnovers. Sacks tend to be a pretty repeatable stat. So you can look at other things, but that baseline of how many points is this team likely to give up is going to get you a lot of the way there for picking pretty good defenses. The next one, and this can be one of the most valuable insights that you can find from Las Vegas, but also one of the most problematic, and that's player props. So if you've never bet on player props before, this would look like, something like Le'Veon Bell. You can bet him to rush for more than 89.5 rushing yards this game, or you can bet him to catch more than 6.5 balls, right? So Vegas is actually going out on a limb and taking a stand on a given player, establishing what presumably would be their guess as to the most likely outcome for that given player in a given moment, and kind of running from there. Again, Vegas is going to have other motivations, like, publicly acclaimed players are going to tend to have slightly higher totals than maybe you would give them. Likewise, players that have been very hot recently tend to be slightly overrated. Although if you pick someone like Patrick Mahomes last season, it didn't exactly work out that way. But again, understanding that Vegas is still going to do a pretty good job of getting pretty close on these projections can oftentimes give you an insight into what would amount to some of the best individual player projections on the internet. Now, I think you can get carried away with this, but I do think player props are at the very least a great way to double check your work. One way I like to use them is I'll go back to lists of player props as sort of a sanity check after we've made our first couple runs in our system to say, why does Vegas think this seemingly random wide receiver is going to have a pretty good week? Oh, I see. It's because Antonio Brown is slightly banged up, and this is going to open up availability for the other wide receivers. Or it could be sometimes that there's an insider with more information than the public has. They are placing big bets on this, or feeding it to sport or to bookies, or people that are betting sports elsewhere, and saying, hey, I know Brown is listed as a game time decision, but it's really more like doubtful here, right? So that might push his total down. It might push other people's projected totals up. So again, using those player props as at least a sanity check, I think can never be a bad idea. I have run into trouble where, our model likes a player more than Vegas or less than Vegas, and I've gotten spooked off some pretty good plays in the past. So I don't think you want to get carried away with it, but yes, I'm always going to at least look at those before pressing submit on my lineups, because I just want to be sure that I'm not missing something glaring that people with a huge financial stake in being accurate have pinned down. Now, some more nuanced ways to use Vegas. Say there aren't any player props for the guys you're considering. There are ways you can use Vegas to try to project game script. So if you're not familiar with the term game script, I'm essentially talking about the sort of flow of the game, how teams are going to wind up having to deploy their resources based on the score of the game. Football, more so than any other game I'm aware of, teams will change their strategy based on the score of the game and how much time is left, right? So if a team gets down by 14 points in the first quarter, they're just not going to feed the ball to their running back, unless they're just really, really disciplined and perhaps not very smart. They're going to stop giving the ball to their running back for excess carries. Like you're not going to get 30 carries in a game where your team trailed by 14 in the first quarter. Likewise, if your team is up by 21 points in the first quarter, it's extremely unlikely that your big name flashy wide receiver is going to catch those downfield targets. So trying to project game script based on Vegas totals, I think actually is a pretty important concept. And I think the players that are most impacted by this are those running backs, because running backs, while there are some exceptions to the rule, like Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley, people that are really involved in every phase of the game, Todd Gurley suits this as well, they're going to get theirs pretty much no matter what happens in the game, because if their team is up, they're going to get the carries. If their team is down, they're still going to catch those balls out of the backfield, so you can't ignore them completely. But run-only sort of running backs like Adrian Peterson last year, I used that example in a previous video, he's just not going to touch the ball if his team is down 14. So keeping an eye on that projected total and trying to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. The best spread we like for our running backs tends to be in that -3 to -6 range, which will say this game probably won't get out of hand, but the team should be up, so this running back is pretty likely to stay involved in the offense. And then the last thing that will happen is if we like tight spreads, we like tight spreads for a number of reasons, by the way. Tight spreads tend to lead to teams not running down the clock, so shorter possessions, which means more possessions for everybody involved. It tends to mean teams stick to their established game plans. And so I'm saying we like this for cash games, right? If they stick to their established game plans, our historical data will be more reliable. And we kind of get the opposite effect when it comes to handling huge spreads. What do you do with a team that's minus 17 favorites? Like, unless they've been minus 17 favorites every game, that's a team that could potentially be pretty erratic. And likewise, a team that's a plus 17 underdog, that team could do anything, right? Because presumably whatever they're going to do isn't going to work. And then the coach will be in a position to say, well, either A, we lose every game, so we're just going to stick to what doesn't work anyway, or B, I need to switch this up because what we're doing so far isn't really accomplishing anything. So just know that huge spreads tend to cause a lot of variance. Now, this can be totally appropriate to target in big tournaments where we say, sure, the Patriots are minus 17 favorites, but heaven forbid the Browns should keep it close here. That will just mean even more production for the Patriots, right? So, maybe the Browns, or, maybe the Browns are a bad example, but say like the Bucs last season, who had a few super explosive games and kept pace with some teams that maybe they shouldn't have. Maybe if the Bucs are going and you think, hey, this team is capable of just busting out a random 400-yard passing game, they're plus 17 dogs here, but if they should happen to keep it close, well, hey, that could be a really interesting big tournament spot for me, right? So huge spreads don't necessarily mean we're going to walk away from it, but it does mean that we're going to be much more likely to only want to employ players from that game in big tournaments. For cash game purposes, I'll consider players on the winning end of those spreads, or the potentially winning end of those spreads, especially if it's, say, like a fill-in running back or a punt or something like that. I'm extremely unlikely to want to play players on the losing side of that unless it's specifically a receiver with a great track record of catching balls in garbage time, or a team with only one running back they use regardless, like the Giants last season. But by and large, I'm going to be extremely particular when it comes to employing players from games with huge spreads. So how do you go and make it happen? Again, check those player prop bets to make sure you're not missing anything big. Watch that line movement throughout the week. This is another key concept that you can kind of key in on, which is that Vegas will say they'll put out lines basically as the moment the previous week ends. And so it's like Monday night or early Tuesday morning, they'll establish a spread for a game. But then as people bet that line up and down throughout the week, that will change, sort of people's projections on how players are going to perform. And oftentimes, again, that can key you in on potential injury news. So, heaven forbid Patrick Mahomes is doubtful in a given week, and the line started at minus 17, but it moves to minus 9 or something like that. You can say, okay, Vegas and the insiders really think that he's going to miss this one. But if it's minus 17 to start the week, Mahomes is listed as doubtful, and the line stays, that leads me to believe that the insiders think he's probably going to play anyway. So definitely watch that line movement throughout the week. It can tell you a story that you might not get from just reading news reports and reading coach speak. And the last thing, remember, Vegas isn't everything. Vegas does have different goals for you. They're not going to, a Vegas line in and of itself, or a player prop in and of itself, does not necessarily directly inform whether a player is a good DFS play or not. And in many cases, Vegas suggesting that a player isn't a good play can just get you separation for big tournaments. So use Vegas, but don't overuse it, and I think that you'll be pretty well off. So that's it for this one, folks. Thanks again. Again, it's James Davis from DFSR.com. DFSR.com/ebook will get you a more in-depth look at all this stuff, and DFSR.com/deals can get you access to the projection system that utilizes all these projections in the first place. So thanks for coming along for the ride. Hope to see you throughout the season.